Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Well, welcome everyone to our special, I guess we could call it sort of an overflow episode of the Politics Guys. We went a little long on Saturday, and so there were a number of stories we really wanted to get to, and also we wanted to tackle some of your questions and comments that you've sent in the last few weeks. And so, if we'd like to start with the story that was really disappointed me. Jay, you posted something about it on Facebook, and I can't tell you how disappointed I was earlier in the week when I opened up the Politics Guys Facebook page and I saw a post from you linking to an announcement that Rob Cordray, the head of my favorite regulatory agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, my beloved CFPB, would be stepping down. And of course, Cordray's led the CFPB essentially since its founding a little after 2010 as part of the Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation. And during that time, CFPB has been a tireless defender of consumers. It's gotten financial firms to cough up almost $12 billion in refunds and canceled debts due to what I'll characterize as the malfeasance, dirty dealing, and flim-flammery of the finance industry. You'll probably disagree. Now, I don't think it's so much that Cordray himself that congressional Republicans object to. It's the independence of the CFPB, which doesn't rely on Congress for its funding. It's funded through the Federal Reserve. And now it looks like the interim director of the agency is going to be OMB director, Office of Management and Budget Director, Mick Mulvaney, who has on multiple occasions characterized the CFPB as a sick, sad joke, I kid you not, and was a leading proponent of dismantling it when he was in Congress. So, Jay, I think it's pretty clear how I feel about this. What do you think?
I know you must be sad.
I am sad. Yes, I am.
Well, your consolation, I think, is that the reasons for Cordray stepping down, and he hasn't announced this. The sense is he's going to run for governor of Ohio. Now, I don't know. I've Ohio Democrats who I've talked to who are sort of in the know have said they think he's kind of getting in a little too late. It's an already crowded field, and there's bizarre stuff going on. But he hasn't announced that he's going to do that. But there would seem to be that may be the plan, and we'll wait and see. But yeah, I understand you would be disappointed. The CFPB, it wasn't even so much that, I think a lot of conservatives had problems with it for partially also the way Cordray was appointed. It was a recess appointment. There was question as to whether that was legit. And in most cases, I think conservatives see this as a sort of a stalking horse for the plaintiff's bar, as opposed to a legit agency. But regardless, we'll see what happens. You mentioned independence, and independence is good, but so is responsible and representative government. So I guess that's sort of the thing. If you have an agency that is really purely unaccountable, does that fit with what we see as a Democratic Republican republic?
Right. And Cordray is not a king or a despot, as I think some in the conservative media make him out to be. He can be removed for cause. It's not like he's just completely unaccountable. But, I think the reason why independence is particularly important in certain instances, like, for instance, the Federal Reserve, or I would argue the CFPB, is the massive influence that the finance industry has over politics in the United States. And so I think this is an instance where a little bit more insulation from political pressure is, I think, incredibly important. Now, one thing that we do know, though, is that whomever Donald Trump appoints to be the permanent head is going to be someone who's far less interested in taking a strong, you might call it anti-financial industry sense. I would call it a strong pro-consumer stance as Rob Cordray. And I got to say, even though we kind of knew this was coming, I'm a little disappointed because his term wasn't scheduled to end until July of 2018. So that's around 8 months of good stuff that he could have done that now is no longer going to be. I mean, I get it. He's got personal ambitions and so forth and so on. So, but, there's going to be a lot of things that won't happen now because Rob Cordray wants to be the next
Missed out
governor
on
of
8
Ohio.
months of good stuff.
I think so. I really think so. So I am disappointed. It just, yet another reason why, or another instance where I think, my God, if only Hillary Clinton had been elected. God, it's hard for me to say that because I'm no huge fan of Hillary Clinton, right? But appointments are so critically important, and just if any Democrat had been elected, and just like any Republican would appoint somebody who's sort of very different from Rob Cordray, so it isn't necessarily a Trump thing. And elections have consequences, and a lot of the consequences don't have to do so much with legislation. That's a big part of it. But with all of these appointments, just like all of the judicial appointments that Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and Republicans are working, very, very efficiently on getting through. And so that's a hugely important thing. It's not nearly as exciting and sexy as some of the other stuff, but my gosh, that's awfully important. And so, I'm disappointed to say the least. So anything else on that before we move on, Jay?
Not much else to say about that, other than I don't think that's the last we're going to hear from Cordray, and you'll be able to pick up the story again down the road.
Well, I hope so. I also moving on. Then I want to mention.
Although I suggested you should put your name in for it.
I think I would be. I certainly would have the enthusiasm for the job. Absolutely.
Right.
Right.
Send me a resume, and I'll see if I can get it to some Republicans who can get it to the Trump people, and we'll see what happens.
Well, I appreciate that, Jay. All right, moving on. But we usually don't talk about trials, criminal trials, but we will this week because it's particularly important. New Jersey Democratic Senator Robert Menendez's federal corruption trial ended in a mistrial, with one juror telling reporters that despite 10 of the 12 jury members supporting acquittal, they couldn't reach a unanimous conclusion. And the reason why this is particularly important is had Menendez been convicted, he would have almost certainly been forced out of the Senate, leaving the seat open for Republican Governor Chris Christie, himself on the way out in favor of a Democrat, to appoint his replacement. So, Jay, any thoughts on the trial or the mistrial and what it means?
I think first we should talk about what Menendez was accused of. And also what he apparently did. It involved receiving significant gifts from an ophthalmologist in Florida, who also had some dealings with the Department of Health and Human Services. Specifically, he is being accused currently of Medicaid fraud.
Massive
about
Medicaid fraud.
$9.5 million.
Yeah.
And Menendez, who just happened to be a friend of this guy, intervened and tried to assist to get the HHS off its back. Kathleen Sebelius, the former director, in fact testified at the trial that she had never been involved in this sort of a meeting, a cabinet level meeting, or one had been requested for a senator to sort of help out a friend. Menendez received, I think it was like $58,000 in travel with this ophthalmologist. That's not even counting his campaign contributions, other gifts. But the problem was what he was actually charged with was bribery, which is tough to prove. And I think most of the jury probably got it right. It's, you can never really tell exactly what they're thinking, but, bribery requires a pretty specific quid pro quo of I am giving Senator Menendez this money, this gift in exchange for this service. And I think it's difficult to connect those dots very specifically. And I think that's the problem that the prosecution had. They probably could have charged him with something less and gotten a conviction. So that's my sense of this, that I don't think he'll be retried.
Well, there will be an ethics investigation.
Given the difficulty in proving those charges, but we'll see.
Yeah, Mitch McConnell said there will be an ethics investigation. I think there should be. I wanted to point out that it's even more difficult to prove this post 2016, where a unanimous Supreme Court.
There's a change in the law.
Yeah, they overturned the corruption conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. And basically, kind of along the same lines that you said, is that the government essentially, their argument in the McDonnell conviction was that just simply agreeing to meet with somebody and, maybe talk about things and showing that there's at least a connection, that's not enough. There needs to be like a very specific quid pro quo thing. And as you point out, that can be, as long as both parties are at least aren't incredibly stupid, that's incredibly difficult to prove. Right.
Right. And unless you put it in an email of Dear Senator Mendez, please intervene with me in my case with the HHS. Here is, how many ever, $100,000 for your trouble. It's tough to prove.
Yeah, exactly. And that can get into, a longer discussion about campaign finance and money in politics and so forth. And, I've talked about this a lot in the past. In fact, a while back, I interviewed somebody who I think is who is a leading figure in this, Larry Lessig, who wrote a book called Republic Lost about that. And if you kind of search your archives, you can kind of find that interview about why this is such an issue. And, the problem is there corruption in Congress sort of doing things in exchange for financial favors? I think almost certainly you'd have to be kind of blind to say that this doesn't go on. But in terms of proving it in a court of law, incredibly difficult to do. And so what do we do given our understanding, or at least our strong belief that money is a huge influence, and a huge influence in a bad way on a lot of members of Congress, but that we can't necessarily prove that direct link? Well, that's a tough problem, So, and Larry Lessig has some ideas about that, and so I would encourage people who are interested in that to check out my talk with him, and I'll remember to put a link in the show notes, as well as to check out Republic.
Yeah, we should, and also because we should point out Larry Lessig is a big deal, and it was a very, very much an honor that he chose to talk to our humble podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really thrilled to have him. I've used his book in my classes and so forth. So it was great to be able to talk to him. All right. Well, Jay, if you're ready, we can move on and take some listener mail. We haven't done that in quite a while, and so there've been a few things that have piled up, and I thought that would be good to get to. All right. Let's see what we have here in our listener mailbag. All right. First, we have Alex, who writes in part, I wanted to start out by thanking you for taking the time to put this podcast on. I know it takes a good portion of your time, and you do a great job. I also want to show sincere appreciation, since I would imagine most of your mail is primarily combative and argumentative, such as politics. So you know where this is going.
I wouldn't say most of it, but yeah. We get some.
Yep. Yet here I am writing in about to do just that, be combative. So here we go.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Jay, I am disgusted by what I think I heard you say on Politics Guys episode 123. It's the episode where we first really kind of brought up tax reform. This was right before the Republican bill was released. Alex writes, I don't always agree with you, but this time it went far beyond that. Your view on how our representatives ought to act is completely unprincipled. What I think you said, in sum, was, if it is beneficial politically to do something, then that is what we ought to expect from our elected leaders, the justification of which being that this is the world we live in. And ought does not derive from an is, Jay. Our leaders represent our interest, not theirs. They are public servants. Government isn't a career but a duty, and it disgusts me to believe that we have so long lost sight of that we have smart people like you acquiescing to a political game of power over principle. The preservation of democracy rests on the ability of leaders to demonstrate restraint, to cherish the ideals of the Constitution, to believe that a world is better run by people than one person or party ruling over the people. If you get a bill without the other side's input, you are failing in your duty. If you are so blinded by your own beliefs that you decry the future president and state that your goal is to make him a one-term president, which Senator McConnell famously did in regards to President Obama, you have no right to call yourself a leader. My point, Jay, is that you really disappointed me. If I correctly understood your view on the government and how it ought to operate, then I'm at a loss for words and heartbroken that you and most likely others have a similar view. In that case, we truly have lost the fight for democracy. Please correct me if I'm wrong. How do you think our elected leaders ought to function? Do you think they ought to function as principal servants of the people? Finally, why are you okay with them ignoring the other half, Democrats, ignoring Republicans and vice versa? So, Jay, what do you think?
Wow. Well, geez, sorry, Alex, sorry to let you down. Look, what I try to bring to the podcast is a sense of how things operate in the real world. And that's based on a good number of years of experience operating in that real world. And also a whole lot of reading and following things on this topic. So, were I to say that everything is sunshine, I mean, ought we to consult with members of the other party in putting together big pieces of legislation? Sure. But let's not lose sight of the Republican representatives were sent there by Republican voters who, they won those elections in those districts or those states. And they have a duty to those voters who expected certain things of them. And some of the things are repeal Obamacare, reform from the tax code. That is necessarily going to bring disagreement from the other side. In some cases, that disagreement is not something that can be. It's a philosophical, fundamental disagreement. I mean, there's no way to compromise on it. And at some point, if you are in leadership, there may be a duty not to compromise on it. If I know this is particularly a frustration of Republican voters, is they send people to Congress who swear up and down, I'm going to repeal Obamacare or whatever, fill in the blank. And then they get there and then they don't do it. And that's, I think, part of the reason, Donald Trump was so successful against a field of more traditional Republicans, is there was an element that says, look, this guy's actually going to do what he says. So look, in a perfect world, ought we to consult and discuss and, just work this all out over beers and so forth? Sure. But my job, as it pertains to this podcast, is to sort of shed some light on how things actually work and how things will actually work. And like it or not, that this is the real world. And I will say that again. If you're the party in power, you need to be able to have the enough votes to get your agenda passed, or you're not really in power. And if to say, well, I think I'm going to go to the other party and get their input first and tell my constituents who elected me to take a hike. Well, that's not really in the service of representative government either. I guess I'll sort of plead guilty as charged. But Alex, I hope it's not me letting you down, and it's more just the world. This is I'm trying to paint a picture of how things actually are, and that's the way I see it.
Well, I guess I'll chime in here to say that I see where you're coming from, Jay, and I largely agree with you. But in a way, I sort of agree with Alex a little bit too, in that I think you're right, certainly, that one thing that we should be doing is explaining sort of what people's motivations are as we understand them and how the political world works based on our experience and reading and so forth. But I also think it's not unreasonable to say, well, we can do that. And we can also say, well, we would we would like to hold our leaders to a higher standard. And if all political analysis is simply about looking at that kind of power politics sort of thing, and if everyone just sort of accepts that as how things must be, then that will always be the case. And so, I think we certainly can point out that while this is how things are, this is not necessarily how we would like things to be or how things perhaps should be in a better world. And I think that maybe goes a little bit toward maybe temperament. People who are a little more idealistic by temperament might want to emphasize that a little bit more. I think sometimes I want to emphasize that a little bit more. And it's not because certainly that I am a greater believer in democracy and the people than anyone else than you are, say, Jay. But I think part of that is just simply temperamental. I don't know. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, there's no need. Look, you can disagree without being a jerk. And I think in a lot of cases, maybe some of our disputes are over that. But let's put it this way: as nice as if Republicans asked very nicely, Democrats, we'd like to repeal Obamacare. Would you care to join us? I'm pretty sure the answer would still be no. And I'm just, again, Trump doesn't help, and sometimes blowing up things that there might be places for compromise. And, and then maybe not to single out Trump, because there were certainly others. And, but does that change the fact that, listen, our country is built on, we elect people who have different beliefs, and they go in there and they're going to represent those beliefs. And at the end of the day, one side is not going to get what they want. I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, would you have advised that Abraham Lincoln should have been nicer to the South? I mean, would that have helped?
Well, I think it's a great point. Yeah.
No, that was a fundamental disagreement. And if you look at this isn't something that's new. Take a look at the founding and the election of 1800 of Jefferson versus Adams. I mean, the nastiness there of two fundamental differing visions. And I think the same thing can be said of the election of Andrew Jackson. This is not something new. I mean, we have people who disagree.
Yeah, I agree
often vociferously, and that's part of it.
I agree with you, except I think there's a lot to be said for at least making that initial effort, even if you're almost certain that it will not be met positively. So there's a difference, I think, an important difference between, say, starting like Republicans obviously are in the midst of attempting to pass major tax reform, something both sides agree needs to happen, though they differ a lot in the particulars. I think there's a difference between starting it off using the regular order, finding out that Democrats are just being intransigent, and then moving on to running it through the reconciliation process. To me, I can understand that. I can accept that. But when you just bypass that entirely, just saying, well, they're not going to buy in anyway, so we're just going to ignore them from the get-go. To me, that crosses a line. I don't think that's okay, whether Democrats or Republicans do it. You at least, I believe that an obligation of the party in power is at least to reach out, to hold a hand out there. And if it's slapped away, then you say, okay, we made a good faith effort. Now we're going to move on. But that good faith effort
has been slapped away pretty hard.
But the Republicans didn't even make that effort on tax reform.
That message was received. I mean, there's some sense of, you don't want to be Charlie Brown saying, okay, this time she's not going to pull the football away from me. I mean,
but nothing gets harmed by making that effort and having it. If the football is pulled away, then you say, okay, we're going to do it ourselves. Republicans could have done that with Obamacare repeal. They could have done that with tax reform. They chose not to do that from the beginning. And to me, now I'm not saying that if you've reversed the circumstances, that Democrats wouldn't have done the same thing. I tend to think that given the amount of polarization, that's maybe more likely than not. I'm not going to get into counterfactuals, but so I'm not trying to say that this is because Republicans are uniquely unwilling to compromise or intransigent or something. I'm saying this is the fundamental problem with how I see both parties as approaching politics. So there you go. All right. Let's move on to our next question. Josh, who comments on our affirmative action discussion, which was a while back, wrote in, I was quite sad that neither of you addressed ways we might actually show that people are disadvantaged, specifically by race, as part of the argument as to whether race-based programs have any place in government. This doesn't prove that certain policies are good or bad, but they can form a shared set of facts to at least be willing to consider. He said too much of the argument you two had on this issue was purely rhetorical. If you want to stop discriminating on basis of race, stop discriminating on the basis of race, which is the comment that Jay made, is a pithy quote, but that assumes, and it's a big assumption, that prima facie race-neutral policies have a race-neutral effect. And I thought this was an interesting comment in that, we did, I think, in our discussion on this, and I thought it was a good discussion, that it was maybe more theoretical, and we didn't really introduce a lot of data on that. And so I wanted to introduce just a few things that I pulled up from a recent from recent survey from the Pew Research Center. For instance, ways that we might show that African Americans are systematically worse off in this country. You can take a look at the poverty rate, right? The black poverty rate's 26%. For whites, it's 10%. Or if you look at wealth, median net worth for white households is $144,000. For black households, it's $11,200. Home ownership rate, 72% for whites, 43% for blacks. Unemployment rate, 4.5% for whites, 10.3% for blacks. Percentage with a college degree, 36% for whites, 23% for blacks. You can go, those are just some things I
Sure.
plucked up. Now, the question being, I think a couple things going on here, and I think this is where you and I can maybe have some discussion, is I think we can both agree that the world is this country is a very different place for African Americans, for other minorities, than for whites. Now, where I think we will disagree as to what that means and what, if anything, government can do about that. Do you think that's fair?
Well, yeah, yes and no. I think the other thing is when you're looking at those kind of statistics, you're looking at broad numbers, essentially on average. And part of the problem that I raised, that I have, and a lot of people have with affirmative action, is if its goal is to help those who are really having a difficult time or have barriers to overcome. Race is probably one of the worst ways to do it. And you could look at something instead that is race neutral, like poverty, like educational background, and that kind of thing, and accomplish the same, if not a better result. So many of the, if the idea of students who get scholarships or race preferred admissions to elite universities. And if you look at that, is it helping that percentage of the black population, let's say, who's really struggling, or is it the case of these are middle class black kids who are edging out lower folks from white Appalachia or something like that? And that's my point. Is race is a terrible way to measure this. I think so many of our problems are less racial and they are more class based, more economic based, but there's a political incentive to call them racial. And also what I said about the best way to stop discriminating by race is to stop discriminating by race. That's not me talking. That's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court talking. So, in a college admissions case. So, to me, I think that's the biggest factor. Is I think it's abhorrent that we look to race rather than these other factors.
Yep. I agree with you to a point there. I think I especially agree with you on the class issue. There's this myth that the United States is a classless society, and it's just simply not true, I think, as a lot of research shows. And I think we do need to pay more attention to issues of class. Now, that said, I also believe that while the United States is a far less racist society than it has been in the past, and we've moved a long way the right direction. I still believe that the discrimination, that racism is shot throughout society, and it's still
sure, no,
pervasive.
absolutely. There's
yeah, okay, and that I think.
but
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just saying that I think that needs to be acknowledged, and it's not all about class. It's not all about economics. There are some very real issues that are related to discrimination, that are related to prejudice, that make things more difficult for African Americans, for other minorities, than they are, other things being equal, for whites. And I think that needs to be addressed.
Well, and look, we've got the legal toolkit to address that, and that's the legal toolkit that's been out there for 50, 60 years now, in saying that if there is evidence of past discrimination, it is appropriate for those institutions that practiced it to take affirmative action. That's where we get the term, to remedy that and to make up for that. But what's happened is that standard of we're using affirmative action to make up for a specific past abuse by a specific specific institution or group has given way to this general diversity. And diversity is all well and good. And you know, I live in a diverse community, and I do so very much by my choice, because that's where I want to live. That's why I want to raise my kids. But it's something else completely for a public institution or a public contractor, whatever, to say, geez, we'd like to have more diversity, which is often not. If you look at what that term really means, when they say diversity, do they mean let's bring in more Asian kids? No, that's not what they mean. So I think that's the sense of where, in many cases, affirmative action, as it was originally created to be a remedy for specific past bad acts, has morphed into something else that is more troubling, and is racial preferences.
Sure, and I hear what you're saying to it. Like I said, to a certain extent, I agree. I think sometimes the problem is that it's difficult to design programs that directly and clearly address past and present racial discrimination, that don't become sort of overly broad, because we tend to focus on things that we can easily count and quantify and so forth. And that can be very difficult to do. And so it is easy to, like you said, design a program that said, well, this makes up for past, racial wrongs. But, well, if it has the result of, say, bringing in giving a preference to some upper class minority student at the, in favor of some lower class, poor non-minority student, is that really a positive thing or not? Those are tough questions. And I think the problem is when people try to design policies, oftentimes it's difficult to make them sensitive enough, clear enough to these sort of specific things. That can be very, very tricky, I think. And so I think you have some good points there. So there we go. All right. All
right. Who else is mad at me this week?
Let's see here. Okay. Well, we have Jacob, who left a comment on our website in response to the Trump-iversary episode. This was my recent interview with my friend Joe.
They're not mad at me. They're mad at Joe.
Mad at Joe. A lot of people were mad at Joe. And Joe, of course, is a Trump supporter, a longtime friend of mine. It's been a friend of mine almost as long as you have, Jay. So here's what Jacob has to say.
That was a bad crowd.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of just really, really strong comments about Joe, especially on Facebook. I picked this one out because I think it gave us something that we could sort of work with, essentially. There were a lot of comments about, but anyway, let me just read what Jacob had to say. First, just wanted to say that I love the podcast and look forward to your discussion every week. I'm in general agreement with the previous comments about Joe's tenor and attitude, which were basically Joe's a big jerk. That was my editorializing. Anyway, I personally find it unhelpful to political discourse, but helpful in understanding how a sizable chunk of voting Americans feel right now. Listening to Joe play whataboutism is fairly obvious how a guy whose main purpose is slapping the cultural left got as much support as he did. My question for the hosts and other Politics Guys fans is this attitudinal approach toward politics more prevalent on the right or the left? Assuming that people like Joe are unhelpful to healthy and constructive politics, how do we begin to change them? And so now my understanding of what Jacob was asking here, and I think it's a really good question, is his sense, the sense of a lot of people, I think, is that Joe, like a lot of people who are kind of strong Trump supporters, weren't really willing to sort of engage, to talk about what people are, the criticisms that people are making, but rather tried to turn every question around saying, well, what about Hillary Clinton, or what about what the Democrats did? That's what I think he means by whataboutism, as opposed to answering, well, what about the person who's actually president right now, that sort of thing. And sort of in a larger sense, that kind of dismissive, mocking attitude toward the people who didn't win the election, basically. I think that's what a lot of people took away from what they heard.
The Latin term is a tu quoque.
Okay, there you go, Jay.
Which means, and you're one too, which is sort of kind of a right back at you for the whataboutism. But
and there's certainly a lot of that we hear, and I struggle with that, I think, myself. And that's why I thought this would be a great question, because I think a lot of people, it's reasonable to ask, well, number one, is this unhelpful? Is this in terms of, constructive political debate? And I would say absolutely it's unhelpful. Jay, what do you think? So that's kind of the first part of Jacob's question.
Generally. I mean, I guess it goes to the question of what you're trying to talk about. My sense is always, for example, if the question is, Trump's a bad person and we shouldn't have elected him because he has harassed women allegedly, or he's made these crude comments, and then the response is, well, what about Hillary Clinton and her actions and helping Bill take care of his problems? To me, that's not a good argument. To me, the better, the honest, conservative argument is, he's got problems. That's not acceptable. But that's a price that many were willing to pay in order to get a better Supreme Court picks. Or you can also look at it as people were very much willing to say, okay, I will pull the lever for Trump, albeit reluctantly, because bad as he is, I still prefer him to Hillary Clinton and what she represents, being sort of the swamp, all that kind of thing. Of look at Trump is certainly an imperfect man, but that's the kind of man we need to drain the swamp. I would refer people maybe to the Team America kind of aphorism. You know what I mean? So I think that's the better way to argue it. Now, there's also sometimes I think pointing out hypocrisy is often not a really good political argument.
But emotionally, it's so satisfying.
Is a hypocrite. Sorry?
I said, but emotionally, it's so satisfying. And I think that's really kind of gets to me, to the nub of it, is that, you're absolutely right, that it's not a good argument, to kind of turning it around that way, but it feels so good. It feels much better than to do that than to say, yeah, well, our guy's a flawed guy, or our candidate's a flawed person, but better than the alternatives. It's much better to say, well, your person is awful. That's much juicier and more emotional, and that's what so much of our politics is. And I think that's unfortunate. But there's an awful lot of psychology research, behavioral economic type research that says, hey, that's just kind of how people are, and that's what so much of our media sort of plays into and tries to really push for understandable,
right, and because what it does, it pushes the media stuff. It gets clicks. It gets viewers. I don't necessarily though think it wins arguments.
No, definitely not.
I mean, I do think the stronger argument is, again, if you think about this, even as bad as Trump is, come on, I mean, we need to be able to put. Quite honestly, that's kind of it was sort of. That was kind of the argument of the Bill Clinton back in the 90s of the the impeachment of, well, what he may have done was wrong, but come on, we've got this great economy, we don't want to screw this up. But anyway, going into hypocrisy, there can be, for example, say, I don't know, Keith Richards makes a PSA saying, don't do drugs. You would say that's hypocritical, but it's not the wrong advice, right? So
you can have a flawed messenger, but a good
messenger
message
can be
yeah,
exactly. When I think the hypocrisy does come in and make a difference is when it goes to sincerity. For example, all right, I'll pick on Matt Damon, who will argue that everyone ought to cut their carbon emissions because the world is in great peril. We're speeding towards certain doom, and yet he will fly around on private jets and use more carbon in those trips than you or I will use in our lifetime combined. And so I think it's right to step up and say, wait a minute, if you're really concerned about what you say you're concerned about, you wouldn't be acting this way.
Or you'd buy
so I
offsets.
think hypocrisy, the hypocrite argument makes sense in that context. But yeah, I think the tu quoque is sort of it's sort of one of those logical fallacies. If the question is your guy fit, then just saying, well, you're not fit either, that doesn't get it. And look, I mean, Joe and I have different approaches to how we put things out there, and I think something that was important from the Joe discussion, and someone else pointed this out, is as upset as many of the liberals who listened to our show were upset and offended and shocked by Joe. That's how conservatives feel pretty much all the time. Meaning that sort of, that's how we feel when we watch Stephen Colbert. That's how we feel when all of this stuff in the popular culture and so forth. So I think it's important that liberals ought to get a sense of that. That's that feeling. That's why people are angry. If you're angry with Joe, please understand that's why a lot of conservatives have been angry with the left, the mainstream media, Hillary Clinton, whatever.
Yeah, I think that gets to the last part of Jacob's question about how we begin to change it. I think it's extraordinarily difficult. I feel like I know that one of the reasons that you and I started this podcast was because we wanted to try to change that sort of thing, and it's extraordinarily difficult to not, when you feel like the culture is characterizing you as being stupid and evil and wanting to hurt people. I always get on my soapbox about Vox, right? You know that, yeah, this love hate. But when I hear Ezra Klein, who's an incredibly bright guy who knows an awful lot about policy, saying, I just don't get why this Republican, or I'll call it Republican policy, is cruel, as if Republicans decided, what can we do to hurt poor people? I mean, that seems to me to be like willfully myopic. And that to me is really problematic when smart people do that. And so many people, especially in the media, do that. And I think, part of the problem is that when you get a whole bunch of liberals together with other liberals or conservatives together with other conservatives who are so focused on feeling aggrieved and looking for conflict, that's what's going to come out of it. And the fewer conversations we have with each other where we don't say, okay, I'm going to assume that you're a decent person who wants good things for the country and your kids and your family, and I do too. So how do we get there? When we don't start from that kind of assumption, then things go off the rails, boom. And that's what we have too much of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I said this, I don't know when, years ago, but I think it was, again, it was quoting Epictetus, that, there's a couple different ways to look at a problem. If you have a conflict with your brother, One way is to look at it as here's a person who I'm conflict with. The other way to look at it is here's my brother. So I think, look, Mike and I we've known each other long enough that we can pretty much say anything to one another. I think that's sort of,
I say so.
And without taking sort of a personal offense to it. Because we have so much other things in common, common experiences, common beliefs. And I really do think that if we would reach out to folks, we'd find out that we have a lot more commonalities than we might think at first blush, and focus on that of this is my friend with whom I have a political disagreement versus this is this evil person. So,
and speaking, going kind of taking this around back toward diversity, that's the sort of diversity it doesn't get, I don't think, nearly enough focus. That, and because there's plenty of survey data and other things that say that nowadays Republicans and Democrats are further apart. Your questions like, would you want your son or your daughter to marry a Republican or a Democrat? It's like, oh God, no, that would be awful. And that's the thing is when you actually sit down and talk to these people, I know a lot of our liberal listeners, my fellow liberals, listen to Joe and thought, this is an awful person. But I mean, I know Joe. I've known him for 20-something years. He's not. He approaches politics in a very different way, but he cares about what happens to his family. He's a decent, personally, he's a salt of the earth type of guy. But
he doesn't go around kicking poor people on the way to work and stuff like that.
And now, that being said, there are some people in this world who are sociopaths, who are awful, evil people. There are, but they're really kind of a small minority. And even in Congress, I would say they're a small minority. Most of the Republicans who, Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, whoever, Donald Trump, I don't know. I'll put him in a separate category. But most of these people are decent people who just have very different kind of fundamental principles, beliefs in how to make the country better. And if we work at it from that, if we go at it from that angle, I think it's a lot easier for us to try to understand each other and maybe try to reach some sort of shared understandings, at least on a few things.
Yeah. And I would, one last thing, I don't want to stomp on that because that was really good, but as a Burkean, and Mike, you're sort of a Burkean too.
Absolutely.
I think there's also, and this goes to identity politics, that look, we need to see ourselves as more than our political identities. Yes, I'm a conservative Republican, but that's not all that I am. There are a thousand different other facets to who I am, and same with Mike and with anyone else. And I think when we get into the habit of defining ourselves first by our political party or ideological affiliation, that we sort of segregate ourselves into these tribes, and we don't need to. So yeah, be more than your party.
Amen.
That's my advice for today.
That's great. I think that's great advice, and we'll close on that advice. So that is it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you like what you heard on this commercial-free episode. And listener support, is what keeps the show going, especially when we're not relying on advertisers, and we really do appreciate it. So if you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can do that by going to politicsguys.com and clicking on the Patreon link. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, hey, we'd really appreciate it if you could share this episode with your friends and followers, or pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. And of course, leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that by emailing us at mail@politicsguys.com or on our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys, where we post stuff throughout the week. Also, we're on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.